What's happening, everyone? I'm Jordan, and this is Front Run Tech. And today we're going to be looking at mainly Bitcoin. We're going to look at the 4-year cycle and where we are at, if the cycle is still valid. And we're also just going to be looking at the macro market structure for Bitcoin so we can really get a good view on what to expect, especially for the new year coming up this year, 2026. All right. So we'll start here with Bitcoin on the weekly chart. And I really want to dive into the 4-year cycle theory on Bitcoin. And we're going to start here with the view that the 4-year cycle is still valid and that it's playing out. All right. And I just want to say that there is a lot of good evidence for this. All right. Now, the things we would look at, we could start here with just the technicals. This is the Bitcoin weekly chart. And of course, the main trend line that's going to be starting at the bear market bottom and coming up right here, that trend line has now been broken on the weekly chart. You see we got the breakdown of that trend line, even a retest, holding it as resistance, and it's kind of just consolidating after that breakdown. That would be one good piece of evidence that the bull market is likely over, and that is a big technical breakdown. The other main thing that people are pointing to, which is also valid, is we're going to go ahead and throw on the 52-week moving average here, right? And we know that we broke down from the 52-week moving average a while ago, and we put quite a bit of distance below it, and we're now just consolidating well below it, right? And we had not broken down from that 52-week in this whole bull market. And if you look at previous cycles, right, we can go back to the last bull cycle, coming into the last bull market, 2020, 2021. The 52-week moving average did not break down until right here, which of course, that breakdown was the beginning of the bear cycle in 2022. All right. And then even if we go back a further cycle and we're looking at this 2016, 2017 bull cycle, when the 52-week finally broke down, Bitcoin was already well into the bear cycle of that 4-year cycle. All right. So that is another piece of strong evidence that things seem to be playing out the same way as far as the 4-year cycles. Okay. Another thing, of course, is simply the timing element of everything. If this was the top here in the beginning of October, of course, that would play out well with the 4-year cycle. We got a cycle top in Q4 of the 4th year, and that would make sense leading into the bear market, that this would be the bear cycle, right? So all of those are actually pretty strong evidence that Bitcoin has in fact topped and is heading into a bear cycle, which, if it were playing out, would probably last anywhere to all of 2026 to maybe the first 3 quarters of 2026, because you could say that it topped a little bit early. But this is a view that a lot of people have right now, and a lot of people are really worried and thinking that the bear cycle has begun. And like I've gone over here, there's good reason for people to think that, all right? Now, I want to go ahead and talk about the other view, which is that the Bitcoin 4-year cycles are dead. Bitcoin is no longer running on those 4-year cycles, and that Bitcoin is going to be following new cycles now. It's now running on more macro cycles, all right? And really, there's really one main piece of evidence for this view, all right? And that evidence is the macro conditions and the money conditions, the Fed macro cycle, all that stuff, okay? And as far as looking at Bitcoin right now, that is the first principle of how I view Bitcoin now and going forward. all right? Because there's one huge thing to think about here. And if we come back to the last cycle, right here, the beginning of the last bear cycle, right, which was the 4-year cycle, the previous one, the beginning of that bear market at the end of 2021, this was the beginning of a Fed tightening cycle, the very beginning of it, which led into that bear market, right? Now, if this is the top of the 4-year cycle, the bull cycle, and that's repeating, this top would basically coincide with the beginning of the Fed easing cycle, which those are two extremely different things, extremely different structures of the overall market, and it would be very hard for me to square that circle essentially. And I do think that, at least for my own view, that that one thing for me it trumps the rest of the evidence. The fact, um, let me just go a bit more into that, all right, and where we are. I made the first video that I ever made on this YouTube channel was actually similar to this video. It was about the Bitcoin 4-year cycles and market structure. And I believe we were somewhere over 100K in this range when I made that video. And one of the scenarios that I talked about as being very plausible was that Bitcoin actually doesn't impulse up into some new leg up, okay? And instead actually dumps all the way down to maybe 85 to 80K range. This is what I said in that video. And I said, if that scenario were to occur, everybody would be thinking that Bitcoin topped for years, the 4-year cycle is playing out, and the bear cycle has started. And where we are currently, I think that is the case, that a lot of people, a lot of the market have been convinced of that because of this drop to 80K, right? And in that video, I said, this would also make sense, or you could make sense of it as far as outside of the 4-year cycle as well. You could make sense of that happening within the macro structure and the macro cycle because a big washout, kind of a very short-term bearish type market for Bitcoin could happen during what I was calling the transition phase from the end of the tightening cycle and into the easing cycle beginning, right? Um, Basically, the market had been very excited about rate cuts starting. Well, rate cuts, the market's already got used to that. Rate cuts have already been going on. That's no longer, a stimulus as far as something for the market to really look forward to. Tightening was still technically going on, but we knew tightening was going to end. We knew it was ending for a while now, so the market already knew about that tightening coming to an end. And of course, now we've gotten the news recently that the Fed is now easing. So the Fed has begun purchasing, I think, 40 billion of treasuries a month, which is the beginning of the easing cycle and the beginning of the Fed balance sheet expanding again. And we're kind of in this transition phase of liquidity to where technically liquidity hasn't really started. It's been kind of stale recently, but liquidity is really, really about to start expanding. And it's hard for me to imagine that Bitcoin is entering into a year-long bear market with those conditions. All right. Some other points are that, we've got the new Fed chair, I think coming in May, I believe. And when the new Fed chair comes, he's going to want to be as dovish as possible. We know this, right? We've also got the state, you know, on a rampage doing occupations of other countries. They want to buy other countries. I mean, they want to increase the military spending to 1.5 trillion. Like, guys, they're about to print so much money, and I just don't see how Bitcoin remains in a true bear market for the next year with these type of conditions that are going to be coming up, right? And another thing we can look at to make sense of this kind of theory that I had put forward months ago in that video is if we go ahead and look at this is a chart of the monetary base, right? And a lot of people like to follow charts like M1, M2. I think the monetary base chart is very important because if you look basically since about February of 2024, the monetary base has really been contracting down still. It's still in this downward consolidation. And right around basically from the beginning of 2024 until now, as the monetary base has gone down, Bitcoin has not done much of anything in that period, right? So that kind of makes sense. But this monetary base is about to reverse, okay? And it's going to start moving back up. And it's going to be hard to imagine that Bitcoin is going to be in a bear market type of market during the reversal and the upwards movement of the monetary base, also of the Fed balance sheet, which has bottomed and is now expanding again, of course. So that is kind of the main view on the Bitcoin 4-year cycle being dead, and just the fact that the bear market or bear cycle for Bitcoin has not begun. That would be that view, all right? So that's basically a good look at those two opposing views, and you might be able to tell if you know me and you've already been watching the channel and been following the X account or just the way I talked in this video, but I definitely subscribe to the 4-year cycle not being in play anymore, and that Bitcoin is going to follow the macro structure and will likely be putting in new highs in 2026. That is my base case for now, and we'll just have to play it as it plays out, right, and see what happens. But um, the one other thing I did want to mention that I forgot. When, this is actually another piece of evidence towards the 4-year cycle theory that I want to make sure I mention to be fair. If we look at the Bitcoin daily chart here, right, and we look at the fractals here, the last bull cycle ending, you had that double wave, kind of double top with a slightly higher top. You also got a very similar thing going on right now, that double wave, double top with a slightly higher top, right, into that severe quick down move that then puts in a slightly higher high right here and goes into um, a parallel channel, a slightly raised parallel channel, which is a bearish continuation. And if you look at what's happening now, we got the sharp move down after the slightly higher high, and now it does look like it's following that same very similar pattern here of moving into a slightly raised parallel channel, some type of bearish continuation, right? So again, you can add that onto all the other evidence we talked about supporting the 4-year cycle and the bear cycle beginning. And again, that's why it's so convincing. That's why it's so convincing to a lot of people that this is what is happening. But, you know, the market never really tends to play out as predicted when it's that easy to see. And I just don't think that a Bitcoin bear market is starting when tons of people see it and think it's obvious. It just would make sense to me that when everybody knows about the 4-year cycle and finally everybody's aware of it and preparing for it, that would be the time that Bitcoin moves into a new structure. All right. But again, the Fed macro monetary conditions are the first principle for me, okay? And they trump all of this evidence. Okay? That's my base case, and that's where I see Bitcoin currently, all right? Somewhere similar maybe to like the end of 2019 over here. Similar type of place as far as the macro structure. All right, now this makes no sense if you're looking through the lens of the 4-year cycle. That is true. If you're not looking through that lens, then this does make sense as a potential point where Bitcoin would be similar to in market structure, all right? So we'll go ahead and leave it there for now. That is my thoughts on the two theories on what Bitcoin is doing and what it's got ahead for it in 2026. And if you guys enjoy the content and you want to follow the socials, you can go follow me on X and on Instagram and on Nostr, and the links for the socials will be in the description of the video. All right, thank you guys.